Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Ryan Callenber, the Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint. Ryan, good to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
And let's talk about the workforce issues that have developed and really are constantly developing and evolving and changing with respect to the pandemic primarily, but a lot of technology change has happened too, adoption of cloud and so forth. And so the workforce issues, it's a moving target. What do you see right now in terms of cyber?
Well, we see the same things that we've been seeing for the entirety of the pandemic. Unfortunately, remote access has opened up doors to ransomware actors that were never there before. Ransomware headlines, despite occasional debates as to whether certain governments have taken action or not, continue to dominate, as I think they will for a long period of time. It's just simply too lucrative for our adversaries. And the really mundane stuff, really does continue to bedevil federal agencies. People are losing money through wire transfers that happen in really simple ways. You can pretend to be whoever you want on the internet when you're not in that same room with that other person. It's very, very difficult to establish traditional markers of trust. And really, cyber adversaries of all stripes, whether you're talking about nation state actors all the way down to the lowest level cyber criminal who just watched a YouTube tutorial, they all kind of use social engineering to take advantage of us when we're all sitting at home behind cable modems.
And when you talk about ransomware, of course, we've seen big instances of this. What is the main vector? Is it phishing? Is that how they get in? I mean, what's the mechanism most of contemporary that you're seeing with respect to that goal of getting ransomware out of an organization?
Yeah, there's two main ones. If you're a large organization, like a meaningfully sized federal agency, it's most of the time going to be email. That said, I think we've actually seen a little bit less email targeting federal agencies versus state and local governments, simply because I don't think most of the ransomware actors think a federal agency will actually pay them. So that's a useful thing to factor into long-term planning, and as well as how we kind of think about the policy behind this issue. That said, though, email is number one pretty clearly for larger organizations. The other one that's incredibly common is a really simple one. If there is remote access set up, you might use a VPN client to get to something that lives in a data center that you need to do your work. You might have something called remote desktop protocol set up so that some vendor can do support of a computer. Sometimes those are just protected by a password. And when you leave that door open, it's almost too easy for the attacker to walk through it. So in a lot of cases, particularly with smaller organizations, they're going to see that. The very, very fancy hacking, exploitation of new vulnerabilities, the vaunted 0 days, those happen much, much, much less often than the workaday email attacks and simple remote access abuse that we see day in and day out.
And with remote access, then somehow the hackers find a credential they can use to use the remote access, the VPN, whatever it is that the agency happens to be deploying.
Exactly. And sometimes that's easier than in other cases. There are lots of people who use the same password for their own personal lives. They use it on different websites. That gets out in the public sphere pretty constantly. And you also have, traditional phishing attacks that work really well in tricking people to enter their password into a simple form. There's even malware that you can install on your computer if you're fooled into doing so that can steal passwords and cookies and other things that represent your credential. So attackers have a lot of options here, but there are very simple solutions that unfortunately not every organization in the world has implemented to make those techniques a lot less effective.
Sure. And just one little detail question on the phishing and social engineering. So therefore you could be duped into giving up credentials, or you could be duped into clicking on something, which would then invoke some kind of a code execution that would get the credentials that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think actually this is one of the areas that I would love, as somebody who's spent their career in cybersecurity, to demystify a little bit. One of the things that I do outside Proofpoint is that I'm on the board of directors of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which puts on Cybersecurity Awareness Month every October and is mostly funded by a combination of DHS and CISA. And one of the things I would love people to understand is that these attacks are not magic. And in fact, you don't actually usually get compromised by solely clicking on one thing one time. That used to happen for sure. When you would click on something, the browser that you were using, and particularly Internet Explorer back in the day, might be vulnerable and the attacker might be able to use that. That almost never happens anymore. So what attackers rely on is usually a little bit more complicated than that. Most of the time, they want you to get it to open an Office document like you would pretty regularly as part of the course of what most of us do for our jobs, Word document, an Excel file, something like that. And there's going to be something in there that says, oh, this is protected, and you have to click this button that says enable content, which in technical terms is called a macro. It's really just a bit of code that the attacker is asking you to run. So there's not this magic stuff that just compromises us without us knowing. Yes, that does exist. If you are a journalist in an authoritarian country, maybe you are actually going to see some of that at some point in your life, but it's very, very, very rare for most of the rest of us. It is really more about human vulnerability than technical vulnerability the vast majority of the time.
So the implication there then is that training and education are really perhaps the most leveraging ways to get after this than some magic technical solution?
Most of the time, that's true. I think for organizations, particularly those that are constrained in budget terms or don't have the technical expertise to run the latest cybersecurity tools, you can accomplish quite a lot by making sure that your people are trained to recognize that if somebody sends you an Excel macro from outside the organization that pretends to be an invoice that you didn't expect, please, please, please don't run that macro. That said, if I were thinking about a broader way to protect against these people-focused attacks, certainly you want to be delivering fewer threats to the average person. It goes back to the remote work question. Everyone is a bit exhausted these days, maybe not able to apply the right degree of scrutiny to things that they're seeing in their inbox versus what they might have been able to do 2 years ago. So ultimately, yes, there are valuable technical solutions that can make sure fewer threats get delivered, but the people really are, in most cases, going to be that last line of defense. And if they don't fall for the social engineering, the attack most of the time will not succeed. And that actually is a tremendous point of leverage, to your point, that many organizations perhaps haven't taken full advantage of.
And so, what are some of the state of the art training techniques and education techniques to make people out front here in your cyber defenses?
It's a really good question. I think we've gotten to the point where the generic cybersecurity awareness training that most of us who have been employed at a large company have clicked our way through, is not necessarily what is going to be shifting the paradigm. If you think about the state of the art is really about focused, tailored things. We expect focused, tailored experiences for most of the things we do, whether it's visiting an e-commerce site or even increasingly interacting with the information technology that our employers provide. And security awareness training is no different. If you're in the finance department, you're going to see a really different set of threats versus one of your colleagues in IT. Because your colleague in IT has a lot of technical privilege, might see a lot more malware. You might see somebody trying to redirect a payroll statement, or somebody who's trying to get somebody to buy gift cards, or somebody who's trying to redirect a wire transfer to a supplier. All of those things are much, much more likely to impact a finance professional. So the state of the art really does depend on that personalization, where organizations that are particularly well instrumented when it comes to cybersecurity can even understand that there's a small percentage of their population. You might have 100,000 people in an agency, maybe about 5% of them ever get an interesting attack. And so being able to shrink the problem and then tailor the training really, I think, is the way to succeed in the future.
And I'm imagining that maybe scientific and research and what you might call the egghead types of organizations, in some ways, because they come from a more collegial culture, say, than finance or IT, might be even among the most vulnerable because maybe they're a little bit more, I don't know, naive about it, expecting the best of colleagues that, hey, take a look at this set of data I just came up with.
You definitely sound like you work for the FBI, but you're also not wrong. I will say, when I got into cybersecurity over 20 years ago, one of the first places I ever tried to build a cybersecurity program was a big biotech company headquartered in California. And they objected to any form of access control because research is open. They all came from university backgrounds. Information should be free. That is what is going to stimulate innovation. And that was absolutely insane, given that the technology that they developed was worth tens of billions. So in the intervening couple decades, obviously progress has been made on that point. But to your point, I think you're really emphasizing an interesting point that is under discussed, which is culture. Culture really, really does matter. If there is a culture of see something, say something when it comes to cybersecurity, and if there is a culture of understanding when risks are taken with data, when somebody's clearly sharing things or configuring things in ways that are risky, if that culture exists, you're in a much better place, even when it comes to implementation of things like technical controls. And a lot of organizations, and particularly leaders on the information technology and cybersecurity front, do better when they focus on their people. They build that culture, and that has really, really positive knock-on effects because there will never be a technical solution to every cybersecurity problem. You will always have to give people access to the data that they need to do their jobs. And if there's a strong culture reinforcing that if that data is stolen, if that data is sent to an adversary nation state, there are consequences to that. And cybersecurity is actually looking for that. And that's not what we do here. It's much, much, much less likely to actually happen.
And every federal agency and pretty much everybody in cybersecurity these days is talking about zero trust and a zero trust architecture, the constant challenge of a credential and the resources it's trying to touch. So it strikes me that a really good zero trust program is about the best backup you can have behind your training so that if a credential does get out, that credential can be challenged successfully by your zero trust architecture. Fair assessment?
I think so. That said, zero trust is almost more of a conceptual framework and maybe best described as a journey rather than even a set of controls. Again, going back a couple decades, we did have the same idea. And actually going back even further, if you look at the foundational texts of cybersecurity, this notion of only give people the privilege they need to do their job, or least privilege, has existed for a very, very, very long time. And zero trust is basically an updated version of that. I think the most useful form of zero trust that I've seen federal agencies adopt, and this is also to some extent true in the private sector, is basically treating every computer like it's untrusted and it's on the internet. Like it's not anything that you can trust just because it happens to be on the same network as you. And so building all of your other controls with that baseline assumption in mind has actually become a really useful way to make sure that one compromised credential malware on one endpoint doesn't turn into a bigger issue. The one thing that I would add to that, though, is zero trust, unfortunately, in a cloud architecture does, if you don't design it well, fall prey to the exact same things that happened in legacy data centers. And legacy data centers actually had some security advantages given that they were not sitting on the internet. And one of the obvious ones is this idea that we, in technical terms, called domain trust. Basically, when you have a computer logged in on pretty much every federal agency's network, you're part of a domain. And that's so that one administrator or a set of administrators can basically make changes to all of those computers at the same time. That's one of the key reasons that ransomware succeeds, because you have to build these administrative tools to manage an entire fleet of computers that have this trust in this domain, as we call it. That is a broken idea in lots of different ways. And unfortunately, some zero trust approaches just think of it like a network thing, like, can I connect to this? But the other way you're connected is that same set of tooling that can impact every single computer in the agency. And that's where I think there's really some interesting work being done in the future of zero trust that will really help things like ransomware attacks become less common.
All right, we're going to take a short break on that note. And when we come back, I want to ask you about some specific client case histories and give us some examples of how this all gets put together. My guest today is Ryan Kallenber. He's Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity at Proofpoint. I'm Tom Temin. This discussion is People-Centric Security, Cyber Strategies for the Public Sector, sponsored by Proofpoint here on Federal News Network.